Welcome, my YouTube channel. Let's go. The day was supposed to be perfect. The kind of day where the past fades into a soft, golden blur. And all that remains is the bright, shining future of your child. For me, Clara Hayes, this day, my only son Ethan's wedding, was the culmination of a life built on relentless thrift, hard work, and the quiet refusal to ever let circumstance define me. I stood near the entrance of the Grand Monarch Ballroom. A hall so opulent, it felt like walking into a gilded cage. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the high ceilings, reflecting the soft glow of hundreds of carefully placed candles. The air smelled of expensive flowers, imported linen, and the suffocating perfume of old money. This was not my world. My world was the smell of sawdust, the comforting weight of a heavy ledger, and the precise, satisfying click of a lock securing a day's earnings. Ethan was marrying Serena Harrington. Serena was lovely, a kind-hearted girl who, thankfully, didn't inherit the worst traits of her mother, Victoria Harrington. Victoria. The name itself sounded like the crisp snap of a new $100 bill. She was the matriarch of the Harrington clan, owners of a chain of high-end real estate brokerages across the state. They lived a life where money wasn't an object. It was the entire landscape. Victoria had made it abundantly clear since the engagement announcement that I, Clara Hayes, Ethan's mother, and a simple, small-town builder who had worked her way up from nothing, was the biggest flaw in her otherwise perfect society wedding. Clara, darling, she'd cooed over tea, a tea party where I was clearly the least valuable piece of porcelain. We adore Ethan, truly, but perhaps for the sake of the photographs, you might consider professional guidance. A wardrobe stylist? We want to ensure you look appropriate. I simply smiled, a tight, polite smile that never reached my eyes. Thank you for the concern, Victoria, but I assure you, I am perfectly capable of dressing myself. Victoria didn't understand that my dignity was not determined by a price tag. I had built my son's future from the ground up, literally. Ethan was now a successful architect, a fact Victoria often boasted about, conveniently forgetting that his college tuition, his first apartment, and his entire life foundation were paid for by my sweat, not her generational wealth. For the wedding, I chose a dress that held deep personal meaning. It was an antique emerald green gown, beautifully tailored but undoubtedly used. I had found it years ago in a vintage shop. It was the most elegant piece of clothing I owned, and I had painstakingly mended and altered it myself. It represented my history, value salvaged and beauty created through effort, ... But to Victoria, it was just old. The first confrontation of the day occurred just before the processional began. I was standing quietly, enjoying a moment of peace, when Victoria sailed toward me, a vision in shimmering pearl gray silk. She had 3 diamonds stacked on one finger, each probably worth more than my first home. She stopped inches from me, her eyes sweeping over my dress with practiced disdain. "Clara," she sighed, loud enough for a small group with her impeccably dressed friends to hear. "I thought we discussed this. That green is simply not working. And is that a repaired hemline? Good heavens. One would think, given Ethan's success, that you wouldn't feel the need to save on the mother of the groom attire." Her friends tittered behind manicured hands. The implication was clear. I was cheap. I was a social embarrassment, and my thrift was a reflection of my inherent poorness. I met her gaze, keeping my voice level, refusing to let her see the familiar, slow burn of the humiliation she enjoyed inflicting. "It's a vintage piece, Victoria," I corrected her, emphasizing the word. "It holds sentimental value." "Nonsense," she dismissed, adjusting her diamond necklace. "It holds dust. Look, I understand. You're from a different background, Clara. A simpler life. But this is the Grand Monarch Ballroom. not a barn raising. Try to blend, dear, just for today. With that final patronizing jab, she turned and rejoined her glittering entourage. I stood there, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks, but the familiar ache of shame quickly solidified into something harder, something colder. Victoria saw my life as a source of shame. She saw my hard-working hands as poor. She saw my choices as cheap. What Victoria didn't know was that I hadn't just built my son's life. I had built the world around her. My career wasn't just small-town building. 30 years ago, after my husband walked out, leaving me with a toddler and a mountain of debt, I didn't crumble. I picked up his tools, taught myself the trades, and launched a contracting firm, Hayes and Associates. It wasn't fancy. It dealt in commercial property maintenance, structural renovations, and long-term asset management. It was a business based not on flash, but on tangible, foundational worth. I didn't buy designer clothes or drive luxury cars. I bought assets. I bought land. I bought real estate. And I specialized in distressed, high-value commercial properties that required intense, hands-on renovation to maximize equity. The Grand Monarch Ballroom, the very venue where Victoria Harrington was currently lording over the upper crust, was one of those assets. 3 years ago, it had been a dilapidated convention center, saddled with debt and facing demolition. I purchased the entire complex at a foreclosure auction. Over 2 years, Hayes and Associates poured every bit of capital, skill, and sheer grit into the project, turning it into this jewel box. The Grand Monarch Ballroom was not just a venue, it was my most significant investment. The deeds to the entire complex, the ballroom, the adjacent luxury hotel wing, and the massive parking garage, were sitting safely in a lockbox, held entirely under the name of Hayes Commercial Properties. Victoria Harrington, in all her real estate prowess, had merely secured a standard, high-priced rental contract for the day, negotiated by her wedding planner, utterly oblivious to who owned the roof over her head. The processional music began, snapping me out of my intense, simmering rage. I took my seat, the emerald dress rustling softly, and watched my beautiful son marry his kind bride. I maintained the perfect, serene mother-of-the-groom smile, but my mind was a whirlwind, calculating. Just for today, Victoria had said, try to blend. No, today was the day to unblend. Today was the day to show Victoria Harrington the true cost of humiliating a woman who chose substance over surface. The ceremony was beautiful, the vows heartfelt. I cried the quiet, proud tears of a mother who had fought hard for this very moment. When it was over, the guests flowed into the ballroom for the reception. The reception was everything Victoria had promised: extravagant, loud, and utterly self-congratulatory. Victoria was everywhere, directing traffic, demanding photos, and ensuring everyone understood that she was the orchestrator of this event. I watched her from my quiet corner at the main table. She was speaking with the wedding planner, gesturing imperiously toward a flower arrangement that needed adjustment. She was, quite literally, acting like she owned the place. This was the perfect stage. The toasts began. My son Ethan gave a beautiful, heartfelt tribute to his bride, and movingly, to me, his mother. "My mom," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion, raising his glass. "She taught me the meaning of hard work. She built our life piece by piece, brick by brick. Everything I am, everything I have, is because of her tireless sacrifice. To Mom." The guests applauded politely, but I noticed Victoria's subtle eye roll, a silent dismissal of the sacrifice narrative. Then came Victoria's turn. She took the microphone, radiating confidence, and launched into a long, rambling story about Serena's childhood, subtly weaving in details about their summer homes and private school tuition. She finally turned her attention to me, smiling with the fake sincerity of a television host. "And of course," Victoria purred, "we must thank Clara for raising such a wonderful young man. It can't have been easy, running a small business and raising Ethan solo. But it just proves that effort, even on a small scale, pays off." She paused, taking a sip of champagne, then leaned closer to the microphone, her voice dropping to a theatrical, condescending whisper. "In fact," she added, "when I saw Clara's beautiful, vintage green dress today, I thought to myself, that's the spirit, a testament to reuse and thrift. And that's wonderful. But dear Clara, perhaps now that Ethan has joined the Harrington family, we can introduce you to the concept of new, full-priced goods. No more repaired hemlines, The laughter that rippled through the Harrington side of the room was sharp and mocking. Victoria had successfully turned my personal choice into a public joke, cementing my status as the embarrassing poor relation. My son Ethan looked mortified, but before he could intervene, I gently placed a restraining hand on his arm. This was my fight, and it was about to reach its glorious conclusion. I rose slowly from my chair. I didn't need a microphone. My voice, when calm, carries the authority of a site foreman. "Thank you for the compliment, Victoria," I said, addressing her directly. "And you are absolutely right. I am a great believer in value, in thrift, and in knowing the true worth of an asset." Victoria blinked, surprised by my sudden assertiveness. "Why, you're welcome, Clara. Now, if we can move to the dancing." "No, Victoria," I interrupted firmly. "We won't. Not yet. Because before we dance, I believe there's a small matter of ownership we need to clarify." I walked toward the wedding planner, a young, nervous woman named Jessica, who had dealt exclusively with Victoria. "Jessica," I said, my voice kind but commanding, "could you please bring me the main contract for the Grand Monarch Ballroom rental, the one signed by the proprietor on the day of the signing?" Jessica, confused, glanced at Victoria, who gave her a sharp, angry look. "Don't be ridiculous, Clara. That's a private, legal document. Why would you need that?" Victoria snapped. "I need it," I replied, looking directly at Victoria, "to prove that I didn't just blend in, as you suggested. I need it to prove that my poor hands do not handle cheap materials, they handle final deeds." Victoria scoffed. "You're making a scene, Clara. Sit down." "Jessica," I repeated, my voice now steel, "the contract, now." Jessica, intimidated by the sudden tension and my unexpected authority, scurried away to the planner's table and retrieved the thick official contract. She hesitantly handed it to me. I held the contract up, flipping to the signature page. "This contract," I announced to the now silent room, "is signed between Harrington Family Events and the proprietor of the Grand Monarch Ballroom, and the proprietor's signature, right here," I traced the line with my finger, "is Clara H. Hayes, CEO of Hayes Commercial Properties." The entire ballroom erupted in a cacophony of whispers. Victoria Harrington's jaw dropped. "What?" she managed, her voice suddenly thin. "That's impossible. We dealt with Monarch Holdings. The building is owned by a corporation." "Indeed, Victoria," I confirmed, letting the contract fall loosely in my hand. "It is owned by a corporation. My corporation. I bought this entire complex 3 years ago, when it was facing foreclosure. I personally oversaw the $5 million renovation to turn it into this magnificent hall." The Grand Monarch Ballroom is my property. I looked at her emerald green dress, the one she had mocked. This used dress, Victoria, was custom fitted by the time I was managing a project worth more than your entire real estate portfolio. I walked closer to her, standing tall and imposing. You mocked my poor hands, Victoria, for mending a hemline. You should know, those hands also hold the deeds to the floor you are standing on, the roof over your head, and the entire parking lot where your expensive luxury cars are currently parked. Victoria was trembling, her elegant composure shattered. Her friends were staring at the floor, suddenly finding their own shoes fascinating. You set me up," she sputtered, her voice choked with shock and rage. "No," I corrected, shaking my head. "You set yourself up, Victoria. I just brought the receipts. You invited me, the poor woman, to your event. And now, as the proprietor, I have every right to make an announcement." I took a deep, satisfied breath. "And here is my announcement, Victoria Harrington," I stated clearly, letting the final, most devastating blow land with maximum force. "Your contract stipulated that any guest, including the mother of the groom, who felt publicly humiliated by the host family, has the right to immediately terminate the contract, effective immediately." The air went dead silent. "As of this moment," I concluded, my voice ringing with final, undeniable authority, "due to your deliberate and repeated public humiliation of me, Clara Hayes, the contract for the Grand Monarch Ballroom is terminated. The wedding is over." The sheer panic on Victoria's face was the most beautiful sight I had ever witnessed. She had achieved her perfect, opulent society wedding, only to have the foundation pulled out from under her by the very woman she scorned. This was not just revenge. This was a fundamental shift in power, proving that true wealth is quiet and true authority is earned, not inherited. The guests, Ethan and Serena, all stared at me, waiting to see what the next move would be. The silence that followed my announcement that the wedding was terminated was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It wasn't the polite silence of an audience listening. It was the suffocating silence of absolute power shifting hands. Victoria Harrington, the queen of this gilded cage, stood paralyzed. Her face, usually so composed and radiating practiced superiority, was a grotesque mask of shock and disbelief. She looked less like a wealthy socialite and more like a child whose favorite toy had been snatched away mid-play. "Terminated?" Victoria finally managed, her voice a strained, high-pitched squawk. "Clara, this is absurd. You can't just cancel a wedding that's already in progress. The food, the band, the guests, do you know how much this is costing?" "Oh, I know exactly how much this is costing, Victoria," I replied, my voice calm but laced with steel. "I own the building, remember? And the terms of the contract are very clear about public humiliation of the proprietor or their direct family." I gestured to the ballroom around us. "I assure you, my vintage dress has never been more expensive than it is right now." The guests, a mix of Harrington's business associates and high society friends, began to murmur furiously. They were looking at Victoria not with sympathy, but with sudden, intense judgment. To them, the unforgivable sin wasn't cruelty. It was being publicly wrong and outmaneuvered. My son, Ethan, finally broke through his shock. He rushed to me, his face pale with concern, clutching his beautiful, confused bride, Serena. "Mom, what are you doing?" Ethan whispered fiercely, pulling me aside, his voice a mixture of respect and panic. "Please stop. I know what Victoria did was awful, but this is my wedding. You can't ruin the day over a dress." I turned to my son, and for the first time that day, I let my smile hold genuine warmth, though it was tinged with sadness. I am not ruining your wedding, Ethan. I am saving your dignity. Victoria didn't just mock my dress. She mocked everything I sacrificed to get you here. She intended to make me a permanent footnote in your life, the embarrassing poor mother. She made it clear that she believes her money gives her the right to humiliate people. I looked at Serena, who was listening intently, her eyes wide with dismay, but also a flicker of dawning respect. Serena, darling, your mother's cruelty is not your burden, but you need to know exactly who you're marrying into, and more importantly, who your mother-in-law truly is. Serena stepped forward and squeezed my hand. I understand, Clara. My mother can be terrible. But what happens now? Where do the guests go? The reception has just started. The reception is technically over, I stated simply, but the celebration doesn't have to be. I looked back at Victoria, who is now surrounded by her husband, Philip, and her most venomous friends, all whispering urgently. Victoria, I called out, raising my voice again to cut through the noise. As the contract is terminated, the premises must be cleared in 2 hours. However, as a mother who sincerely loves her son and his new wife, I am offering a personal wedding gift. I pulled a small engraved silver key from a hidden pocket in my used dress. This key, I announced, holding it up, opens the penthouse suite on the top floor of the adjacent Hayes Grand Hotel wing. It is fully stocked, has a private chef waiting, and enough space for your immediate family and closest friends. The true celebration of Ethan and Serena's marriage will continue there, as my gift. Victoria's friends were outraged at the termination, but Serena's younger, more sensible friends and Ethan's colleagues were now looking at me with undisguised awe. A secret owner of a multi-million-dollar complex who shut down the party to defend her honor, then offered a penthouse suite as a consolation prize. That was the stuff of legend. Ethan finally looked at me, a profound realization settling over him. He knew I had made serious investments over the years, but he had no idea I owned this. Mom, he breathed out, you own the hotel too? Hayes Commercial Properties, honey, I corrected with a triumphant, quiet nod. All of it. Now, go take your wife and your father and anyone who actually loves you both, and go celebrate. This ballroom spectacle is done. Ethan, understanding that this was my non-negotiable act of self-defense, smiled, a genuine relieved smile. He kissed my cheek. You're incredible, Mom. Thank you. For everything. He and Serena quickly ushered their confused but intrigued guests out of the ballroom, toward the private entrance to the hotel wing. I was left with Victoria, Philip, her meek husband, and the expensive detritus of their ruined event. Victoria, regaining some of her fury, stormed towards me, her face blotchy with rage. You spiteful, calculating woman, she hissed, trying to keep her voice down, but failing. You knew, you owned this place, and you let us sign a contract, just so you could pull this cheap parlor trick. This is professional malfeasance. This is defamation. Defamation? I arched an eyebrow. I simply exercised the rights of the proprietor as specified in your contract. You broke the clause about treating all wedding guests with dignity. I acted accordingly. And as for calculating, yes, I am. I built this place with the exact calculation you despise. Thrift, silence, and patience. Philip, Victoria's husband, finally spoke up, though his voice was weak. Clara, please. The cost of this setup, the loss of reputation for us. Couldn't we have settled this quietly, for the sake of the children? For the sake of the children, I said, looking Philip straight in the eye. Victoria needed to be taught that the world doesn't always bow to the Harrington name. She needed to learn that mocking a woman's hard work is not merely rude. It is financially dangerous. That is the real lesson I am giving your children today. And the rental fee, Victoria spat. We expect a full refund. You terminated the contract. I pulled out a small laminated card, the standard business card for Hayes Commercial Properties, and handed it to her. The rental fee, Victoria, covered the first hour of the reception, I said, my voice softening into a dangerous sweetness. The termination is immediate, but unfortunately there are no refunds for breaches of the dignity clause. The initial deposit, however, will be fully allocated to the cost of the immediate deep cleaning required after this unceremonious exit. This isn't over, Clara, Victoria whispered, her eyes promising a legal war. My lawyers will hear about this. You can't afford a legal fight with the Harringtons. I simply smiled, a genuine, unconcerned smile. I can afford the best, Victoria. Hayes Commercial Properties has diversified assets exceeding 8 figures. And unlike you, I pay for my lawyers in cash. Enjoy the walk to the hotel wing, Victoria. It's a lovely building. But remember, the next time you step on someone you consider poor, make sure they don't own the ground beneath your feet. With that, I turned my back on the Harringtons. My work here was done. The embarrassment, the termination, and the profound, visible revelation of my true wealth had been executed flawlessly. But as I watched Victoria storming toward the hotel, her posture rigid with humiliated fury, I knew the real war was just beginning. I had shut down her party. Now, she would try to shut down my life. The next morning, the local social media and news outlets were buzzing. The story was a goldmine. Billionaire mother-in-law terminates wedding over used dress insult. Or, hidden owner reveals massive wealth, evicts guests. The photos of the stunned Harringtons leaving the Grand Monarch Ballroom were priceless. I spent the day in my quiet, modest home office, a space filled with blueprints, ledgers, and the comforting smell of old paper, meeting with my legal and financial team. They're going to come after you, Clara. My lawyer, Mr. Henderson, no relation to Robert's past farm, warned me over a Zoom call. Defamation, breach of contract, intentional infliction of emotional distress. They have the money to tie you up in court for years. Let them, I said calmly, looking at the image of the enraged Victoria on a news clip. They operate on flash and intimidation. I operate on facts and contracts. Did I violate the contract? No. The dignity clause is ironclad, though usually unused. You simply executed it spectacularly. Did I hide my ownership? No. Hayes Commercial Properties is the registered owner. Victoria simply never bothered to read past the Monarch Holdings line on the invoice. Her hubris blinded her. Then, let them spend their money, Mr. Henderson. Every dollar they waste fighting me is a dollar they can't use to expand their real estate empire. And speaking of expansion, I smiled, pulling up a digital map of the city. I need you to acquire the final deeds for 2 specific properties, Mr. Henderson, discreetly. Use 3 separate shell companies. I don't want the name Hayes or Monarch associated with them yet. I pointed to 2 locations, the sprawling, ornate Harrington family headquarters building downtown and the massive Harrington family trust estate in the exclusive hills. Why those 2, Clara? They're priceless, and almost certainly not for sale. Mr. Henderson asked, bewildered. Not for sale yet, I corrected, my eyes glinting with the memory of Victoria's taunts. Victoria intends to teach me a lesson about money. I intend to teach her a lesson about vulnerability. And there is no greater vulnerability for a real estate empire than the ground it stands on. I knew Victoria's game. She would try to hurt my business. But what she didn't know was that while she focused on the surface, I always focused on the foundation. The next few weeks were a flurry of quiet, strategic moves. Victoria Harrington, true to her word, launched a public campaign of character assassination, giving interviews where she painted me as a vindictive, small-minded woman jealous of her son's success. But the press was already on my side. The image of the poor woman who owned the ballroom was too compelling. Victoria's attempts to portray herself as the victim only made her seem more arrogant and entitled. The legal threats arrived, thick stacks of expensive paper filled with hyperbolic demands for damages. My legal team, well-funded and thoroughly prepared, met them with surgical precision, forcing the Harringtons to spend vast sums simply defending the legitimacy of their own failed claims. While Victoria fought the legal war on the surface, I initiated my deeper financial siege. I knew that the Harrington family trust estate, their grand home, was a massive burden. They rarely used it, but kept it as a symbol of prestige. Their business headquarters, too, was a massive expense, tied up in complex, long-term lease agreements. I had spent my life studying the intersection of debt, liability, and asset management. I knew that the best way to destroy a wealthy foe wasn't to take their liquid cash, but to make their most precious, symbolic assets suddenly toxic. I instructed my team to begin buying up the underlying debt and mortgages associated with both the headquarters and the estate, leveraging the deep pockets of Hayes commercial properties, all while remaining completely anonymous. This was a long game, a financial strangulation that would take months, but I was patient. I had been patient for 30 years, waiting for Ethan's wedding. I could wait a few more months to see the look on Victoria's face when she realized that her house and her empire's foundation were both ultimately controlled by the woman whose hemline she had mocked. I returned to my work, the quiet, satisfying rhythm of building, calculating, and waiting. The used green dress was hanging in my closet, no longer a symbol of my past, but a trophy of my future. The Harringtons were busy fighting their lawyers. They didn't see the silent, structural damage I was inflicting beneath their feet. And that, I knew, was always the greatest power, the one they never see coming. The immediate aftermath of the wedding termination was a deafening silence from the Harringtons. It was the silence of a wounded predator regrouping. Victoria wasn't capable of letting go of a public slight. She was busy converting her fury into corporate strategy, not realizing I was already 10 steps ahead, playing a completely different game, a game of foundations and leverage. The legal paper continued to stack up. Victoria's lawyers filed a massive, multi-million-dollar lawsuit against Hayes Commercial Properties, alleging everything from malicious business practices to tortious interference. It was an expensive and theatrical display meant to signal that she was unbowed. But I was unfazed. My primary focus wasn't the lawsuit. It was the Harrington family headquarters building. I had discovered a critical vulnerability. The Harrington family did not own the land beneath their massive, ornate office tower outright. They owned the building structure through a complex ownership trust, but the underlying land was subject to a highly restrictive, long-term ground lease held by an old, notoriously private investment firm, Cressida Capital. Victoria and Philip treated this lease as a perpetual rental agreement, secure in their belief that Cressida Capital was an untouchable, passive entity. They were wrong for the past 3 months. While Victoria wasted millions on legal grandstanding, I had instructed Hayes Commercial Properties to initiate a quiet, aggressive acquisition of Cressida Capital's entire portfolio. It was a massive financial undertaking, one that required leveraging the full breadth of my assets, including the Grand Monarch Ballroom and the adjacent hotel. Clara, this is a hostile takeover of a multi-billion-dollar entity just to gain control of one city block. My financial advisor, Mr. Chen, exclaimed during a video conference. It's unprecedented, expensive, and risky. Explanation. It's not risky if the reward is absolute control, Mr. Chen. I countered, looking at the spreadsheet detailing the acquisition status. Victoria Harrington believes her power is in the height of her building. I am investing in the depth of the foundation. Once we own Cressida Capital, we own the ground lease for the Harrington headquarters. And once we own the ground lease, I am her landlord. The idea was simple: financial strangulation followed by absolute territorial dominance. Victoria mocked my thrift. I would show her the terrifying power of capital accrued through 30 years of uncompromising diligence. Finally, the day the takeover was finalized was anticlimactic. No headlines, no fanfare, just an email confirming the successful acquisition of Cressida Capital. The land beneath the Harrington family's central empire now belonged to Hayes Commercial Properties, quietly and anonymously. I waited 1 week for the legal dust to settle, allowing the Harrington legal team to continue their costly battle against a non-existent threat. Then, I delivered the first financial shockwave. I instructed Mr. Henderson to use his newly acquired authority as the new legal representative of Cressida Capital to issue a standard, quarterly ground lease invoice to the Harrington Family Trust. When the invoice landed on Philip Harrington's desk, he nearly had a stroke. The rental rate, which had been static for nearly 20 years, had been quadrupled, citing market correction, increased infrastructural costs, and historical undervaluation. Philip called my lawyer immediately, shouting about extortion and illegal contract adjustments. I assure you, Mr. Harrington, Mr. Henderson calmly informed him the terms of the ground lease permit the proprietor to adjust rates based on current market evaluations and operating costs, with 90 days' notice. We are providing that notice. The new rate is entirely legal, though certainly aggressive. Who is Cressida Capital now? Philip demanded. Who is behind this hostile move? A new holding trust, Mr. Harrington, Henderson replied, sticking strictly to the script I had provided. They are focused purely on maximizing asset yield. Victoria, now involved, entered the fray. She smelled a competitor, a major firm trying to squeeze them out. She mobilized her resources, trying to uncover the identity of the new owners, attempting to use her influence at the city planning office and the county recorder's office. But I had engineered the takeover with the same meticulous, anonymous efficiency I used to save those pennies. Untraceable, relentless, and perfectly legal. The quadrupled rent wasn't the goal. It was the pressure. The new lease rate instantly turned the highly profitable Harrington headquarters into a massive, bleeding financial liability. Victoria now had to choose: drastically cut her luxury lifestyle and operational expenses, or liquidate an asset. And I knew Victoria Harrington. She would rather burn the building than appear less wealthy. Meanwhile, the legal war continued to sputter. Victoria scheduled a mandatory mediation session for the breach of contract and humiliation lawsuit stemming from the wedding incident. She intended to make a grand showing, demanding a public apology and crippling financial compensation. The mediation was held in a sterile, glass-walled conference room. Victoria arrived looking like a warrior goddess, a bespoke suit, perfect hair, and an entourage of 3 expensive, ruthless-looking lawyers. I arrived alone, wearing the same simple, tailored suit I wore to my building sites. My demeanor was quiet, focused, and utterly non-confrontational. Victoria couldn't resist a final verbal jab before the mediator arrived. "I see you've decided to save money on lawyers, Clara," she sneered, leaning across the table. "You'll find that in this room, thrift is not a virtue, it's a weakness." On the contrary, Victoria, I replied softly, placing a simple, worn leather briefcase on the table. I've learned that if your finances are strong enough, you only need one lawyer, and that lawyer should be unafraid of your threats. When the mediation began, Victoria's leading counsel, Mr. Sterling, a different, highly polished Sterling, launched into a dramatic and exaggerated recounting of the wedding termination, emphasizing the irreparable emotional damage and reputational loss suffered by the Harrington family. They demanded $5 million in damages. Then it was my turn. My sole lawyer, Mr. Henderson, didn't argue the facts of the humiliation. He simply passed a single document to the mediator and Victoria's team. It was a standard notice of lease termination for non-payment. The address listed on the document: Harrington Family Trust Estate, Victoria's colossal family home in the hills. Victoria snatched the document, her face turning ashen as she read the letterhead, which belonged to a third, completely anonymous holding company I owned. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice rising to a shriek. "We own this house. This is a joke." "It's no joke, Victoria," I interjected gently. 3 months ago, you took out a significant mortgage on the estate to fund a failing investment project. That mortgage was quietly acquired by one of my holding companies. I noticed you missed the last 2 mortgage payments because, I suspect, your liquidity is currently tied up defending this pointless lawsuit and paying the quadrupled rent on your headquarters. The mediator stared in stunned silence. Victoria's lawyer was whispering urgently in her ear. As the current holder of the mortgage note, I continued, folding my hands calmly on the table. I have the legal right to demand full, immediate repayment, or initiate foreclosure proceedings on the Harrington Family Trust Estate. The deadline is 48 hours. Victoria was breathing heavily, clutching the notice. She realized I wasn't fighting her lawsuit. I was dismantling her entire life structure, piece by piece. She had money, but I had leverage over the very ground she stood on. "You did this," Victoria hissed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You bought my mortgage. You're trying to destroy us." "I am simply maximizing asset yield," I quoted, repeating the phrase my lawyer used. "The same goal you have always boasted about. You wanted to teach me that I was poor. I am teaching you that your assets are fragile." I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a low, powerful tone that commanded attention. "Now, let's talk about this $5 million lawsuit. You have 2 choices, Victoria. Choice 1. You proceed with your lawsuit. You will lose, but the legal fees will ensure you default on the foreclosure of your home, and I will own the Harrington estate within the week. Choice 2. You immediately and publicly drop your $5 million lawsuit against Hayes Commercial Properties. In exchange, I will grant you a temporary extension on the estate mortgage and revert the headquarters ground lease to the original rate for 6 months. Victoria was trapped. She could pursue her revenge and lose her family home, or she could swallow her pride and save her most sacred symbol of wealth. She stared at me, the woman in the used dress, and finally saw not a simple builder, but a financial architect who had quietly built an unassailable fortress of capital. "Is dropped," Victoria whispered, the admission of defeat tasting like ash on her tongue. I nodded, the soft click of my briefcase closing sounding like the final gavel of justice. "Thank you, Victoria. I look forward to seeing the paperwork." The lawsuit was dropped immediately. A quiet, almost embarrassing event that was a huge professional blow to Victoria's reputation. The public who had been following the drama understood that the self-proclaimed victim had suddenly and mysteriously surrendered. But I wasn't finished. I had given her a 6-month reprieve on the ground rent and the estate mortgage, not out of kindness, but to set up the final, irreversible blow. Victoria, desperate to escape my financial vice, started quietly preparing to sell off assets to regain liquidity. She thought she was escaping my trap. She started with the Harrington family headquarters building. The only way to survive the crushing ground rent and the massive mortgage interest I was still charging was to sell the building's structure to a third-party developer. This was exactly what I wanted. Victoria and Philip began negotiations with a massive national real estate group, Magnus Holdings. They believed they were finally regaining control, selling their problem to a deep-pocketed buyer. I waited until the deal was hours from closing. Then, I delivered the final, most satisfying twist, a public, professional execution that would ensure Victoria Harrington would never recover her social standing or her professional authority. I called an emergency board meeting of Cressida Capital, my holding company that owned the land beneath the headquarters. I, as the silent owner, demanded an immediate press conference be held outside the Harrington headquarters building. The press gathered, eager for the latest twist in the Clara Hayes versus Victoria Harrington saga. Victoria and Philip, furious, stood on the steps of their building, trying to block the cameras. I stepped up to the microphone, wearing my simple, powerful black suit. Today, I announced clearly, I am here not as Clara Hayes, the mother of the groom, but as the owner of Cressida Capital, the company that owns the land beneath this very building. The gasps were louder than they had been at the wedding. Victoria looked physically sick. "Victoria Harrington," I stated, looking at her one last time. "You mocked my poor hands and my used dress. You forced me to fight a costly lawsuit when all I wanted was respect. You tried to sell your building to escape my control. Well, Victoria, you lose." I looked directly into the cameras. As the ground owner, Cressida Capital has decided to exercise a previously unannounced right of first refusal on the sale of the Harrington headquarters structure. Effective immediately, Cressida Capital is taking ownership of the building structure itself. This meant Victoria couldn't sell to Magnus Holdings. The sale was legally mandated to go to me, the ground owner, at the same price. But more importantly, I concluded, pulling the final, humiliating thread. I am announcing the immediate dissolution of the Harrington Family Trust. The entire complex will be bulldozed next month to make way for a new, affordable housing project sponsored by Hayes Commercial Properties. I had not only seized her most prized corporate asset, but I had erased the symbol of her power, all while gaining immense goodwill for supporting affordable housing. Victoria Harrington had lost her building, her legacy, her home. The foreclosure would now proceed, as I had no reason to delay it, and her dignity, all to the woman she had mocked for wearing a used dress. Justice, I decided, was the perfect fit, and it was certainly full-priced. The sound of the bulldozers tearing down the Harrington family headquarters building was not merely construction noise. It was the relentless rhythm of justice served. For me, Clara Hayes, it was the definitive end of the war Victoria Harrington had foolishly started. I had not only regained my dignity, but had demonstrated a power so absolute that it rendered Victoria's former wealth utterly meaningless. Period. In the span of 4 months, Victoria and Philip Harrington lost everything. Their corporate headquarters, their cherished family estate, foreclosed and currently listed for sale by Hayes Commercial Properties, and their social standing, which had evaporated in the face of my quiet, devastating financial maneuvers. They were exposed as arrogant bullies whose entire empire was built on a fragile foundation of inherited debt and surface-level prestige. But the silence from the Harringtons was replaced by a more complex and painful noise, the strain on my son Ethan's marriage. Ethan and Serena, my beautiful newly married couple, had been forced to witness the total destruction of one family by the other. While Serena was relieved and privately proud that her mother's cruelty had been answered, the sheer scale of the financial ruin was a heavy shadow over their honeymoon period. They came to my modest, still functional home a week after the demolition announcement. Ethan looked worn, older than his years. Serena was quiet, clinging tightly to her husband's hand. "Mom," Ethan started, sitting across from me in my home office, surrounded by blueprints and financial journals, the tools of my quiet empire. "Serena and I need to talk about everything." "I know, darling," I said softly, closing my ledger. It was a massive operation and messy. I apologize for the necessary chaos. "Necessary?" Ethan asked, his voice laced with confusion. "Mom, you didn't just win a lawsuit, you bankrupted them. You literally bought the ground they stood on and bulldozed their headquarters. They are living in a rented apartment, trying to liquidate Philip's old cars just to pay for groceries. It's annihilation. They deserved the consequences, Ethan," I stated simply. "Victoria tried to erase my worth, publicly, at your wedding. She was arrogant enough to believe she could financially crush me when she learned the truth. I simply taught her the difference between symbolic wealth and strategic capital." Serena finally spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "I agree with you, Clara. My mother was cruel, and she needed a lesson in humility. But why the house? The estate wasn't just my mother's. It was where I grew up. Why did you have to foreclose on their home?" The question was fair. The corporate revenge was strategic. The foreclosure on the family home felt personal, even cruel. "That house was a symbol, Serena, and symbols have power," I explained gently. "Victoria was using that mansion, that facade of generational wealth, as her shield. As long as she had that estate, she would have continued to wage war, pouring money into legal battles instead of recognizing her defeat. I had to remove her comfort zone, her platform, to force her to stop the attack. It was the only way to ensure she would finally leave us, and you two, in peace." I looked from Serena's pained face to Ethan's conflicted one. "But the answer to your question, Serena, is also why you and Ethan are here. It wasn't done for cruelty. It was done for leverage." I pushed a thin file across the desk to them. It was a single-page document, subsection. "This is the deed to the Pinnacle Ridge property," I said. "It's the lot next to the old Harrington estate. It has a beautiful smaller home that was not officially under their main mortgage." Ethan picked up the file, confusion furrowing his brow. "When I initiated the foreclosure," I continued, "I used my funds to discreetly purchase that specific adjacent property, and I had my legal team quietly buy the mortgage note on the main estate. The day I got the deed to the Pinnacle Ridge property, I immediately had the property lines legally adjusted." "Adjusted how, Mom?" Ethan asked, already dreading the answer. "I legally adjusted the boundary lines so that the Pinnacle Ridge property now owns the entire driveway and the main septic field serving the Harrington estate," I stated, a faint, technical smile touching my lips. "The estate is now structurally reliant on my property for utilities and access." Serena gasped. "You created a financial chokehold and then a literal chokehold on their home." "Exactly," I confirmed. "I gave them a 48-hour deadline to surrender the lawsuit in exchange for temporary reprieve on their house, knowing I held the ultimate, silent control over its use." I took a deep breath. Victoria and Philip are now homeless. But they are not destitute. The estate is being sold for a vast sum. However, the next buyer will discover the utility and access problem, which will drop the value significantly. They will be forced to buy the connecting land, the Pinnacle Ridge lot. I tapped the deed in Ethan's hand. "The Pinnacle Ridge property is my wedding gift to you two. You now own the controlling interest in the sale of the Harrington estate. You can sell it to the new buyers at market rate." making a vast profit. Or, if you want to teach Victoria one final, quiet lesson, you can simply keep it and force them to build a new road and septic system on their remaining land, costing them millions more. Ethan and Serena stared at the deed, then at me. They saw not a vengeful mother, but a strategic protector who had wrapped her revenge in an unprecedented financial windfall for her children. "Mom," Ethan whispered, his conflict dissolving into awe and relief. "You didn't just win the war. You designed the peace treaty and gave us the spoils." "The peace treaty is your marriage, honey," I said, finally standing and walking over to hug them both. "I removed the hostile forces and gave you the foundation for your own new empire. You now have the capital to be truly free from the pressure of both my money and the Harringtons' expectations. Use it wisely. Build your own legacy." The final act of the saga wasn't a corporate takedown, but a quiet, emotional reconciliation, not with Victoria, but with my son and his wife. Serena's relationship with her mother, Victoria, was permanently strained, but she was liberated. The constant pressure to maintain the facade of perfection was gone. She and Ethan took the money from the sale of the Pinnacle Ridge property and built their own life, far away from the pressures of society weddings and corporate warfare. As for Victoria and Philip, they moved to a smaller, more remote town. They were forced to rebuild their lives and their business on the principles they had always mocked, starting small, working hard, and living within their means. They never publicly spoke my name again, their silence a testament to the finality of their defeat. I received a final, strange communication from Victoria 6 months later. It wasn't a legal threat. It was a simple, short letter, delivered by courier. "Clara, we've started a new small brokerage here. It's modest, but it's ours. I finally understand the cost of a repaired hemline. It's not about the money. It's about the conviction. You built your life, while I merely inherited mine. You are, quite simply, the most terrifyingly effective woman I have ever met. I will not cross you again." I didn't reply. The cost of the used dress was paid in full. My life settled back into its quiet, focused rhythm. I was still the CEO of Hayes Commercial Properties, still spending my days in my office, surrounded by ledgers and blueprints. I had traded the anonymity of being the poor mother for the quiet respect of being the most feared and effective businesswoman in the state. The Grand Monarch Ballroom continued to thrive, but I ensured that its policies were explicitly clear. The dignity of every guest is paramount, and the proprietor's decision is final. Years later, I attended Ethan and Serena's housewarming party. Their home was beautiful, built by Ethan, and paid for by the capital I had strategically placed in their hands. It was a home built on love and honest finance, not on facade. As I stood there, watching my son happy, I knew the true reward of my revenge. It wasn't the destruction of Victoria Harrington's assets. It was the protection and elevation of my own family's foundation. I had been mocked for thrift and for my used dress, but the lesson I taught was eternal. The woman who knows the true value of every penny will always defeat the woman who only knows the cost of a diamond. And that, I realized, was the most satisfying return on investment I could ever ask for. The enduring legacy of the used dress, the destruction of the Harrington family headquarters was finalized. Where the ornate, arrogant symbol of Victoria's wealth once stood, there was now a sprawling, meticulously managed construction site. It was slated to become the Hayes Community Commons, a project dedicated to affordable housing and small business incubation. My public image shifted from the vindictive matriarch to the quiet, philanthropist. Though I knew the real motivation was always about the deep, satisfying echo of justice. The corporate war was over, but the story's true moral had yet to settle. And it wasn't about the money. It was about the lesson I had etched into Victoria's life. The epilogue of the antagonists. Victoria and Philip Harrington never recovered their former status. They were forced to simplify, to genuinely start over. The financial shock and the immense public humiliation shattered their social standing. They sold off their remaining trivial assets and focused solely on the small brokerage firm they started in their new, quiet town. That true power doesn't scream. It signs the deed. The legacy of the son. My son Ethan and Serena flourished. The capital from the Pinnacle Ridge property, the strategic asset I had gifted them, allowed Ethan to start his own ethically driven architectural firm. Serena found her passion in designing sustainable housing, working closely with the Hayes Community Commons project. Their life was built on authenticity. They learned that the most dangerous people are not the ones who wear cheap clothes, but the ones who silently know the true market value of integrity. My final act, the strategic maneuver to gift them the leverage, removed the final toxic element of financial dependency from their marriage, ensuring their foundation was strong and entirely their own. The finality of the dress, I kept the antique emerald green dress. It hung in a glass display case in my private home office, not as a vanity piece, but as a historical artifact. It represented the exact pivot point where Clara Hayes, the self-sacrificing mother, became Clara Hayes, the unyielding proprietor. Sometimes, when I looked at the neatly repaired hemline that Victoria had mocked, I remembered her cruel words. One would think, given Ethan's success, that you wouldn't feel the need to save on the mother of the groom attire. She had missed the point entirely. I didn't save because I needed to. I saved because I understood the power of deferred gratification. Every stitch I mended, every penny I saved, was not an act of poverty, but an act of financial rebellion against the very ideology Victoria represented, the belief that worth is granted by price tags. My greatest strength was that I never sought recognition from people like Victoria. I sought control, and the day I stood in the Grand Monarch Ballroom and terminated her wedding, I didn't just reclaim my dignity. I proved to the world that when you humiliate a woman who has spent her life building, you risk having the ground beneath your feet legally taken away. The dress was used. My power, however, was brand new, full-priced, and fully capitalized. The moral lesson, closing statement. For anyone listening to this story, remember the lesson of the Grand Monarch Ballroom. Never underestimate the quiet strength of the woman who knows how to mend, how to save, and how to build. She doesn't need to flaunt her wealth because she owns the infrastructure that supports the world around her. She understands that the real difference between the rich and the poor isn't what they spend, but who owns the deed to the property. And when you mock her thrift, you are merely giving her the perfect reason to finally maximize her asset yield, starting with your utter and complete ruin.